Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Welcome back to our Holistic Academy podcast, where we connect the dots between our mind, body, and the human experience. I'm Amy.
And I'm David. And here we are with another episode to tackle a topic that sits at the absolute center of our work. It's a word that makes most people flinch.
It really does. And that word is vulnerability. So, welcome to this episode, Sharing Vulnerability Journeys into the Heart of What We Hide. For centuries, if you looked up this word, its entire story was about weakness. In Latin, the root vulnerare literally means to wound. So from the 16th century on, it has been defined as a passive state, the susceptibility of being wounded or harmed. And in philosophy, the goal was invulnerability. The Stoics, for example, argued that true well-being was about building an inner fortress, a character so strong that external events couldn't wound you. So vulnerability wasn't just a given, it was a flaw to be eliminated. In the 20th century, the story of vulnerability was completely rewritten and underwent a profound conceptual flip. It started against the backdrop of global war when the existentialist philosophers were forced to confront the human condition head on. Thinkers like Martin Heidegger and John Paul Sartre looked at the world and said, wait. They argued that this groundlessness is the human condition. Heidegger called it thrownness, this idea that we are thrown into life, a history, and a body we didn't choose. Sartre said that we have this intrinsic lack of self-identity, and they argue that vulnerability isn't a flaw in the system, it is the system.
Wow, Dale, that's a very powerful reflection about just the roots of the word and how these researchers take into a deep, let's say, a deep analysis of what is happening within our own minds, within our own emotions. And at those exact times, the new field of psychoanalysis was exploring this from an internal perspective. While Freud was focused on unconscious drives, it was his colleague Alfred Adler who really ran with this idea. Adler's story is fascinating. He was a frail child who suffered from rickets and a near fatal case of pneumonia. And those early experiences of vulnerability shape his entire theory. He proposed the inferiority complex, which is a pervasive, deep-seated feeling of inadequacy across all aspects of life. And Adler argued that those universal feelings of inferiority we all have in childhood are the primary driver for all human growth. For Adler, your perceived vulnerability wasn't the problem, it was the engine. It's what motivates you to compensate, to build skills, to create a life.
Exactly. Oh, that's a great insight, David, from Freud and Adler. So the philosophers first defined it as vulnerability as our fundamental state, and the early psychoanalysts saw it as our primary motivation.
Yeah, exactly. But society at large is still treated as a weakness. And this is where the sociologist Erving Goffman comes in. In the 1950s and 60s, he gave us this powerful metaphor of life as a dramaturgical performance. He said, we are all actors engaging in impression management, wearing masks, really, and playing roles to protect our public face from the vulnerability of social judgment. We build this psychological armor to protect ourselves, and that armor feels safe. And I think that we really do that, and we are constantly performing and using these masks, and we change one when we approach certain people of our family, and we take it out and we put another one when we are at work, and then we change it when we are with our friends, and then we change it when we are in our relationships. So it's just a game of using these kinds of masks.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, David. And I can really relate to what you're saying. I mean, I feel like growing up, we have to maybe put on these masks to help us feel safe and belong to certain communities like our family or our school or society. But yeah, it definitely feels like something that you do to protect yourself. And as I've grown up, I've had to slowly demask all these versions of myself to get inside and really connect to my authentic self. So it's a real thing that we put on these armors to protect ourselves. But the humanistic psychologists in the third force emerged in the 50s and 60s and started to ask, is being vulnerable safe for us? And humanistic psychology is the third force as it emerged as a reaction against two dominant forces in psychology at the time, psychoanalysts and behaviorism. So this third force, humanistic psychology, actually offers a more holistic perspective, emphasizing healthy individuals who have agency, strive for growth, and are driven by desire to find meaning and fulfill their potential. So I quite like this branch of human psychology myself, and it's a big pivot in the story. This is where Abraham Maslow comes in with his famous hierarchy of needs. Well, that's one theory he's famous for, but he also framed vulnerability as the fundamental choice of a lifetime. He said one can choose to go back towards safety or forward towards growth. So what that means is, well, he argued that safety is feeling like you need to avoid vulnerability and stay stuck in your patterns and hide. So it's the direct antithesis of growth.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more because I think that we really shape ourselves to be safe, and we develop these kind of walls and masks, and we try to push away our childhood traumas, and then they resurface when we are adults, and then we start seeing the same patterns of our parents, and we repeat the story over and over. So he made that brilliant point of avoiding discomfort doesn't actually make you robust. It makes you more vulnerable for the times when things don't go according to plan. It's the choice to move into the stress and discomfort that builds a robust mind.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So turning on these reasons why vulnerability could be a superpower. So if Maslow gave us the why, that we use vulnerability for growth, his colleague Carl Rogers gave us the how. Carl Rogers was the pioneer of person-centered therapy, and he proposed that the single most important attribute for a therapist wasn't knowledge, but congruence.
That word is so powerful because so many people can show up as a person, mostly if they are public figures. And then when you know about them, they just are normal people that have different kind of weaknesses and things and patterns that they also have to address, but they show up as perfect. It's just that this game of the social platforms where they show up as they want. So this word for me, I think, is very strong, and congruence is really just a clinical term for authenticity, genuineness, and the therapist not wearing a facade.
Yeah, I can also relate to that. I think my therapists in the past who don't feel congruent, I don't feel like I can fully be vulnerable with them or trust them, right? Because they don't resonate that they're fully being themselves either. And I guess in a professional setting, you can't fully be yourself. You do have to have stronger boundaries, but it is nice when the therapist does work and you have sort of this authenticity shining and they can really help you start making more choices towards your personal desires than all these belief systems and adopted fears or even behaviors that you have from your family. It's a way that you can really like remove all of those layers and come back to your true authentic self and genuineness. So yes, I really like that idea, and this is why in some ways therapy can work, because it can help you recalibrate to that authentic self. So back in 1957, Carl Rogers, he published what would become one of the most influential papers in psychotherapy, the one where he laid out his necessary conditions for therapeutic change. And right at the top of that list was something that might sound counterintuitive. He said that the client has to be in a state of incongruence for
Mm.
therapy to be effective. So in plain language, that means the person has to feel off balance, exposed, maybe anxious or unsure of themselves to be prepared for therapy. But here's the twist. Rogers, too, he didn't see that vulnerability was a flaw or a weakness. He saw it as the door, maybe the only door through which real healing can enter. So, what actually opens that door? It is not a clever technique, it is not a diagnostic label, it's the therapist congruence. So, as I was mentioning, their own real, genuine, unpolished presence. Rogers believed that when a therapist shows up authentically without hiding behind professional masks, it gives the client permission to do the same. So you can see why it's such a delicate dance for therapists to get it right in their position of perhaps authority there and power being a therapist. But it's also important that they themselves show that they're also flawed and that they're not perfect. And I think that's also true in families. It's important with our children to show that as an adult, we're also flawed and imperfect, and we're okay with that, and we make mistakes and we need to apologize and learn from them and repair things, but that's part of life. So it is important, as we say, to be our authentic self and be vulnerable to people around us.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Rogers, he said then that by the therapist being authentic, it allows the clients to do the same and open up. And I guess as well in friendships too, if you find that someone else is often vulnerable and opens up, it almost gives you permission to do the same. So Rogers, he reframed vulnerability. Instead of being the thing therapy tries to eliminate and make you strong, I guess, vulnerability became the very starting point for transformation. It wasn't the enemy anymore, it was the invitation.
Yeah, of course. And I really also agree with that kind of transformation, because once you begin to accept your own flaws, your own, let's say, patterns and reflections of what you have suffered throughout life, that's when you start digging more into these wounds and taking out everything that you have inside, even going generations older than just one than just your parents, and understanding why many patterns happen into your own family, into your life, and what kind of psychosomatic diseases you are inheriting, because many of the diseases that also were presented in your grandparents, in your parents, are related to many of these vulnerability issues. So by the 1960s, the theoretical script has been flipped, and vulnerability now is reframed as the engine of growth and is the prerequisite for healing. So now it's good to be vulnerable, and also we will talk about that because it's not, of course, the excess that we see sometimes also in the platforms, but it's just a healthy way of being yourself, no? But this is all still theoretical. How do we measure it, and how do we prove that it works?
Mhm. Good questions. This is where the story can shift, I guess, more towards the empiricists. So, as it starts, and it so often does with children, in the 1950s and 60s, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth were developing the famous attachment theory.
Hmm. The, that's a really powerful theory also about how we have this attachment to mostly physical things, no? That we can feel that attraction to them. So this is like the secure base and the secure attachment. And this is the developmental mechanism for our entire capacity to be vulnerable.
Exactly. So these studies with children were conducted by Ainsworth in a strange situation experiment where they used different infants and examined how they engaged in explorative behaviors. So when a child does explore, it is the behavior of pure vulnerability where you're moving into the unknown, and if only if they will only do it if they have a secure place to come back to. Otherwise, they won't engage in that. So they have to be certain that these children, when they might become scared or distressed by the unknown, their caregiver will comfort them. So that was a huge step into understanding the importance of vulnerability. And personally, I didn't have the most safest attachment growing up. So I have very insecure and avoidant attachment. So being vulnerable for me becomes a challenge because I wasn't able to necessarily always trust that my caregivers would be there or know how to support me when I opened up with certain challenges. So it's something we can all re-heal and repair as an adult, but it's a real thing that all of us will struggle with depending on how securely we were attached when we grew up.
Yeah, I share that, and I share that background also of having this unsafe environment, and that makes you also hyper responsible and hyper aware of things of your environment, and when you are safe, let's say, to trust other people, and of course you are more let's say sensitive to deception and disappointment. And that's why we many times people that have this childhood with unsafe environments, we are uh, not being comfortable with vulnerability, and we really struggle to open up in terms of trusting more people. So our ability to be vulnerable isn't a trait, so we are born with it, and it's an interpersonal skill that we learn. Insecure attachment styles like avoidance are simply brilliant. They are learned strategies for managing vulnerability in an environment where it wasn't safe to express your needs.
Exactly. So just like me, it was easy to avoid things than confronting them. And it became a coping mechanism to keep us safe and important strategy. So, it was not a bad thing necessarily in the environment I was in growing up. It needed to happen. But like you said, it's not something we're born with. You learn about it. So as you grow up in different environments, you might feel more securely attached, and that can help you open up, like I have in certain places, for people who are much more conscious and able to hold that safe space. And that's really where the transformation can happen. As you said, it's all interconnected. So a lot of the times that we're wounded is from someone else, and the way we can heal it is also through someone else showing us a different perspective or allowing us to feel and heal those emotions and speak vulnerably. So, whilst Ainsworth was studying the origins of vulnerability in children, a humanistic psychologist named Sidney Durrard was studying its practice in adults. In 1964, he published The Transparent Self, and he was the first to empirically and explicitly link the act of self disclosure to mental and physical health. I think
Hmm.
that's an important point. Maybe we should say that again. He
Yeah.
linked the act of self disclosure to mental and physical health.
Yeah, I really believe that because otherwise, I always relate to this kind of, let's say, quote that emotion, the word emotion, has energy inside and it needs to move. So it needs to go somewhere. If you don't express it, if you just repress, it's gonna stay within your body. So that's just what happens in these terms. And his central thesis was astonishingly bold, and he basically said that mental illness is the result of an absence of self-disclosure.
Exactly. What an interesting guy. So, Gerard, he argued that when we succeed in hiding our being from others, when we wear that Groffman-esque armor, we lose touch with our real selves, and that contributes to illness. And I can definitely say for myself, when I feel like I'm not living authentically in alignment with who I am as a person, my identity and my values, I also don't feel well, satisfied, motivated, and even my thoughts aren't as positive, so I get more sick quickly. So, in other words, by not being in our authentic selves, we start to feel dis-ease in our bodies, leading to a decline in our health.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something that I also can speak about more in personal experience because also when I was in different kind of jobs and corporate jobs where I had to sustain a mask, where I had to be diplomatic, let's say that's the word they use, so that you can behave according to rules and just comply with the job description that you have, then I also think about those days, and I was sick mostly every 3 months, more or less. I had some kind of flu symptom or cold or headaches, whatever it was. My stomach also suffered a lot. So since I left those corporate jobs, I think it has been my healthier stage in my life. So I couldn't agree more that the more we have to play a role inside of someone's rules, then we lose our own identity. And by losing that, and by losing self expression, and by, let's say, repressing all of those feelings, we start becoming disease. And Girard was essentially putting a psychosomatic hypothesis on the table. And he said that manly act of remaining tense, opaque, putting on the armor and performing is a kind of work and very struggling work. And that work imposes stress and consumes energy. But that is still a hypothesis, and he didn't have this physiological data to back it up.
He didn't, but then the man who found it did. That brings us on to 1980s and the work of social psychologist James Pennebaker.
This is my favorite part of the story. Pennebaker was fascinated by what he called the polygraph confession effect. He would heard from law enforcement that individuals would be physiologically exploding with stress, high heart rate, high blood pressure, while they are while they were concealing information. And the second they confess, their physiology would completely normalize. Total relaxation, even when that confession meant they were going to prison.
That's amazing. And yeah, what a big realization. But I think I can also relate sometimes if I've made a mistake and I keep it in, or even have to make a small white lie, I don't feel good about it. So by just being vulnerable and honest and saying, I've messed up, I need to tell you what's gone on. And I'm not proud of this decision, but I just want to get it off my chest, and you deserve to know. I also feel that sort of silent sense of relief to let it out, even. So I definitely think that Penny Baker realised Jared was right. Hiding is actually such an active, stressful work, and it feels much easier just to be totally vulnerable and share your authentic self. We are all human and we all make mistakes, and as hard as that is, it's not as hard as keeping it all in and hiding it, because yeah, we're keeping all of those emotions pent up as tension in our body. So yeah, hiding is really stressful work.
Yeah. Well, he also designed a test which became known as the Pennebaker paradigm or the expressive writing model. And his 1986 study with Sandra Beale is the landmark. He had participants write for 15 to 20 minutes over 4 consecutive days, and he split them into groups. The control group wrote about superficial topics like their shoes, and the experimental groups wrote about a personal trauma. But, and this is the critical part, he split the trauma groups, and some wrote only the facts, some wrote only their emotions. The key group was instructed to write about their deepest thoughts and feelings about the trauma, integrating the cognitive and the emotional components.
What an interesting experiment. And what did the results say?
Well, what they show up was that the short term results were just what Maslow could have predicted. The group writing about the deepest thoughts and feelings, the most vulnerable group, actually felt worse immediately after writing. Their physiological arousal went up, so it was acutely stressful.
Wow, so the choice is clear: stay safe and stay stuck, or lean into that discomfort and actually grow. I think that experiment generously demonstrates, that the difference between avoidance, where you stay in comfort, safe to what you already know, leaves you stuck in those same patterns. Whereas if you're able to engage in something new and sit in that discomfort, you're able to find that space of transformation. And that's what some of those psychologists like Adler were saying, that we need to be vulnerable as a way to open the door to our own healing. So although safety and our ego has developed that from our child to protect us, it's the growth that really changes us.
Yeah, exactly. But here is the punchline. 6 months later, that exact same group showed significant benefits in physical health, which was measured objectively by less frequent visits to the health center.
Wow.
And the groups that wrote only emotions, the catharsis group, or only the facts, show no benefit. So the healing wasn't in the venting, it was in the integration. It was the vulnerable act of taking the raw experience, organizing it, and giving it meaning that finally eased the chronic physiological strain of keeping it all shut down. And I think this is so, so important because It's not just about venting, as this word is saying. Is not just telling your friends and telling everyone how you feel, because you are just replaying these same emotions again and again and creating even more negativity. But it is more about finding the patterns, finding the meaning, and finding and designing. And I think that's the struggle, designing a new layout for your life.
Yeah, I agree. And that integration piece is really important.
Mhm.
But yeah, this is the first time we're seeing that hard psychological evidence that the armor we wear is actually what makes us sick. And that vulnerable expression, real expression, authentic expression is what helps us heal. And honestly, I've lived this. I remember being in therapy and feeling like I was peeling myself like an onion, layer after layer of masks that I didn't even know I was wearing. And I was just trying to keep up to show this polished surface level superficial version of myself. But it was only when I began really integrating the deeper stuff, and really, like you said, David, applying it to my life to make new choices and to create a new pathway, then the meaning, the emotion, and the patterns, everything eventually actually changed, and I felt so much better. So I think one advice from my therapist was really try not to just keep reading online about what's happened to you, because even though scrolling through psychological tips and online gurus might feel like they can heal us, we can know the concepts in our heads, but if we don't truly integrate them in our own lives, in our own behaviors, and into our really psyche, then our relationships, our choices and stories will not change. So it's really important to realize healing isn't informational, it's transformational, and it takes the entire integrated self and the information that we take from these healing vulnerable experiences and move forward with a new decision and a new perspective, so that we're not stuck in that overthinking of how terrible it was or how you can never move on from that, whereas you can actually see that's something that happened and it wasn't as bad as you thought, and even if it was really terrible, you've learned a great deal out of it, and that can turn all that stress and trauma into a lot of growth and resilience. So sometimes we do go through bad things in life and we have our breakdowns, but that's to show people that we can also break through these things, and that can build our sense of identity. So sometimes we do have to go through struggles to really find that life and know what's important and align and calibrate to that authentic self and version of ourselves that we truly are.
Yeah, I was also thinking about how also people just say the words that I already know that I have this trait or I have this pattern and I know what I have to do, but they don't do anything. And they just keep deflecting the guilt or the patterns and blaming other people. So this game of blaming or the other game of being in the complete opposite extreme, which is people pleasing and not showing up as you really are because you are afraid of how people can judge you, can also repress so many of these experiences and repress your own way of being. I really don't understand sometimes how can people be more concerned about what others can think and less concerned about how they really feel. So for me, that's just a contradiction. And that's why when we move forward to now the modern voices like qualitative researcher Dr. Brené Brown, which I love her podcast, her impact makes so much sense. Her work is empirically grounded and literally grounded theory, like her last book, built from thousands of interviews, and she's a kind of story catcher who constructed a whole framework of vulnerability from the lived experience of real people. she pulled together all these threads and distilled vulnerability for the modern era, or uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure.
Yeah, she's an amazing person, Brené Brown. In fact, I was listening to a few of her podcasts today before this episode. But she definitely completely flips the Carl Rogers ideas that he was talking about. And she argues that vulnerability, of course, isn't a weakness at all. It's actually our key measure of courage.
Mm.
And in her words, there is no courage without vulnerability. And the biggest thing standing in the way of that courage, well, this is wrapped up in shame, the fear of disconnection, the fear that if people really knew us, we'd be unlovable. So I think this is a really important part of our podcast where we could potentially have a discussion about gender, because I think men and women are taught completely different messages about shame and vulnerability. For example, for men, the message starts early and it hits hard. You've got to man up, don't cry, don't be like a girl and show weakness. In fact, in for masculine norms and in our society, vulnerability is said to be a weakness. So for men, they don't want to feel weak as that would cause them shame. And for a lot of men, sadly, and me too, shame isn't just I made a mistake. Shame is I am a mistake. So it's not I did something wrong, it's I am wrong. So they're feeling this terror of feeling really unlovable, of not belonging. So, of course, men who grow up with that script and try to uphold the masculine norms of being strong and never vulnerable don't want to even touch their emotions. So, that's why in our society at large, we've got a lot of emotionally unavailable men. And that's just because they've been indoctrinated from such a young age with this belief system that they shouldn't show their feelings. Whereas it's just an uncomfortable feeling and something unpleasant to feel sad, scared, or uncertain. And I think it sometimes feels like a threat to who they're supposed to be as a man if you're going to feel these uncomfortable emotions, especially if being a real man, as I said, means being strong, controlled, unfazed by anything. So for them to feel any emotion or a bit of tenderness, a bit of femininity can feel quite dangerous. So that might be one reason why men avoid being vulnerable, but also women can as well. And I think we get a slightly different narrative, but it leads to the same locked door in being vulnerable. Women are taught that our currency is perfection. So we want to be kind, but not too kind, achieve, but don't outshine, look good, but don't look like you're trying too hard. And then obviously and inevitably we fall short at something on our checklist and we add to another superficial insecurity that we get distracted about rather than looking into ourselves. So that just starts anyway, the shame again when we're not feeling perfect. And this time, the weakness is that imperfection, the fear that people are going to see our cracks and they're going to see someone who isn't enough. So
Mm.
I think it's important to notice that, yeah, there are societal and cultural conditions that prevent us from being truly vulnerable. And whether it's a man avoiding anything that looks like weakness or women hiding anything that looks like imperfection, we see the same result, this shutdown. Especially in British culture, we're not vulnerable at all. So, yeah, we stay quiet, we armor up, and we trade this authentic connection for protection. And the irony is, vulnerability is the very thing we're taught to fear. It's the thing that actually builds that strong, deep belonging and connection that we're all yearning for.
Yeah, I agree. And as we mentioned before, the more you feel that a person opens up with you and tells you who they really are, I think that's when you feel that you have a real friendship, a real sort of this connection of energy that resonates with you. And it just gives you this kind of um, level of safety that immediately you feel that your mind is activated again, and you can flow with your own authentic self. And I think you grow a lot with these kind of friendships instead of the ones that you have to pretend. So let's get into the mechanisms now of how does this practice of being vulnerable work for both men and women. And let's start with your field, Amy, which is emotional regulation.
Mhm. Yeah, it's important that we learn in our society to regulate ourselves. And the research at the moment is very clear that avoiding vulnerability using strategies like emotional suppression is a maladaptive emotion regulation strategy. I like this saying, when you resist, it persists. And as we've seen, you supposedly will feel sick. So it shows that regulation as well isn't just an intrapersonal process, it's interpersonal. And we can regulate our emotions through other people.
Yeah, and that's what we were discussing, that when we open up, we really um, regulate ourselves through the mirror of feeling the same with other people, resonating, and also many times sharing stories that can be different, of course, in terms of the characters, but the scenery, the plot, let's say, of the trauma is the same, and even the music, let's say, can be the same. No, so now the secure base or secure attachments for adults.
Yeah, that I agree. If you open up more with friends, you can create a more secure attachment as adults as we grow on. And it's been quite nice, David. We've mentioned before our podcast when we have a little interaction, we often talk vulnerably about our own lives or the good and the bad things. And it's helped us not just be professional collaborators, but also friends and supporters of each other. And that's been really lovely to have that and create that secure attachment to someone from probably a different culture, millions miles across the world, with a totally different upbringing and different parents and environments and schools. But yes, the fact that we've both been able to be vulnerable has been like the secret sauce almost to helping us have this deeper connection and to create such a beautiful podcast such as this that we've been designing to help share all these exciting and hidden mysteries and facts and sort of decoding those holistic ideas to live a better life. So yeah, to create this secure attachment in adulthood, as you were saying, is an invitation for co-regulation where you're able to vulnerably disclose yourself to someone else. So when you share about yourself, you invite empathy, which actually fosters this shared emotional state. So if someone else feels similar to you and can empathize, like, oh, that would also make me feel angry, or that's also rubbish, I can't believe that happened to you. Or, yes, I'm super happy for you too. That helps co regulate both of you having that empathy. And that's why therapy, as well as group therapy, can be very beneficial.
Yeah.
However, we need to make sure we talk about it. The risk is real. You really should be careful to who you open up to. And I've had further re traumatizing situations in the past where you are vulnerable with the wrong person. So you must be careful knowing who you can trust. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But studies shows that if vulnerability is met with low support or invalidation, it can in fact amplify the distress you feel.
I remember a very powerful story from also these corporate jobs. I usually I am very transparent in who I am and what I say and what I talk, and sometimes I have had this mistake of trusting people that I shouldn't have trust, because they can share information about what you are telling them with other people and causing you very, let's say, disturbing problems. So it is really good to be careful of who you open up with, and first try to just probably launch some difficult questions to that kind of person so that you can see if you can really trust them or not. And yes, those things happen. So we are humans. We are going to make mistakes, but don't worry. Every time you do that, you are growing, as we said. So it's good to be also having those mistakes. And that's why Brené Brown makes the distinction between vulnerability and oversharing. Oversharing is vulnerability without boundaries, and that's what we see in social media sometimes, that they just show this fake vulnerability so that people can connect with public figures. Or there is another relationship that can hold it, and it is not skillful, and it results in disconnection and not the connection.
Yeah, I've definitely also been a victim of an oversharer before and having too much verbal diarrhea. I just want to share everything about myself to people sometimes. But yes, we learn it the hard way by oversharing. Sometimes you think, wow, why aren't those people wanting to connect with me? And it's probably because you just shared a little bit too much. So it is a real skill. And as Brené Brown mentions, people have to earn the right for you to be vulnerable with them and share your secrets. If you don't feel like you can trust anyone, even your partner, about some things, then don't share those intimate details about your lives. Vulnerability needs to be joined with boundaries where you have discernment for who you trust and who you share it with. So, moving from this really important point of boundaries and vulnerability, what about it on the cognitive level, David?
Well, this for me is the cleanest mechanism. The avoidance of vulnerability leads to cognitive rigidity. And this is a landmark 2010 review by Kashdan and Rothenberg, who identified psychological flexibility as a fundamental aspect of our health.
This is
And
the work of Stephen Hayes and acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, right?
right. Yes, ACT defines psychological flexibility as the ability to remain open to experiences and engage in actions aligning with personal values, even when faced with emotional or cognitive discomfort. And its opposite to experiential avoidance, trying to avoid your own unwanted thoughts and feelings.
Cool. So psychological inflexibility is the rigid avoidance of vulnerable feelings, and that's seen perhaps as a core transdiagnostic feature of most psychopathology, like depression and anxiety.
Exactly. Yes, in the ACT model, vulnerability isn't some abstract emotional idea, it's the acceptance part. When you practice vulnerability, ACT calls this diffusion. You are not fused to the thought anymore. You can actually step back into that self as context space and observe what's happening instead of getting swallowed by it. And here is the cool part. Once you are in that space, you can make a committed action based on your values and not on your fear. There is even research showing vulnerability boost creative problem solving. And one study found that when people realize they are vulnerable to cognitive fixation, basically stuck thinking, their creativity actually goes up. Admitting vulnerability to rigidity is the antidote.
Ah, I see. So instead of feeling stuck in our thoughts and spiraling, we can creatively see out of them. And that totally reframes resilience. The old school model treated vulnerability and resilience like opposites, like you either had your armor on or you fell apart.
Yes, a brittle model.
Exactly, because armor makes you rigid, not strong, and the newer model flips that whole idea. Vulnerability isn't the opposite of resilience, it's the path, in fact, to resilience. So, practicing vulnerability builds our authenticity, which can become that deep foundation of self awareness and real confidence. And this is how it can build our own self compassion. And most importantly, it's the counterforce to toxic shame. So, Brené Brown's research shows that the shame and fear cannot survive in the presence of connection. When you take a risk, show something real, and someone meets you with empathy instead of judgment or shame, then, well, if they meet you with empathy instead of judgment, shame just loses its power, I guess. And that's how people become more stronger, not because of the armor, but because of the courage to take it off and be true to yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's what we really need in these days, because the more we face this empathy with other people, the more we also give them this leeway and this safe space to really display what they are feeling and go into a deeper kind of healing experience. And we can see all of this at the biological level now. That armor you and Gerard mentioned, it's a state of chronic physiological stress.
How?
Well, here is the brutal truth. When you are constantly hiding, constantly suppressing, performing, editing yourself, people pleasing is also there. You are not just tired, you are dysregulating your entire stress system. And the HP axis, which is the one that controls all the stress, your body's main stress response network, gets thrown off. And when cortisol starts swinging out of balance, that's one of the clearest biological markers of for vulnerability to major depression. And guess what? Even suicide.
Oh no, that's such a shame. But connection, real connection, the kind built from skill, discerning vulnerability, interrupts that whole cascade.
Yeah, it doesn't just interrupt it, it buffers it. Intimate, validating relationships literally stabilize cortisol. And there is a study from 2022 showing that something as simple as a romantic partner's hug reduced the cortisol spike from acute stress in women. And get this, vulnerable self disclosure can actually create adrenocortical attunement. So your stress hormones sync up with your partner's. Your biology gets regulated through connection.
And that regulation ripples out into the immune system.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's all one network. Psychoneuroimmunology tells us that chronic HPA activation or chronic stress drives chronic low grade inflammation, which is the cause of every disease. Inflammation is a vulnerability factor for almost every chronic disease we know. The antidote, well, the psychological states that vulnerability cultivates is self compassion, optimism, authentic connection, are directly linked to lower peripheral inflammation.
So you can trace a direct line from an emotional choice to a cellular level benefit.
Yes, that's the most amazing part of our bodies, that we can trace it right into the brain. So think of it as a neurobiological state switch. The threat state, driven by shame and fear, is associated with high activation in the brain's threat network, especially the amygdala.
The armor then is on.
Yes, the armor is on, but the practice of vulnerability flips the switch. First, a 2012 study in PNS found that the act of self disclosure is intrinsically rewarding. It activates the brain's mesolimbic dopamine system. It feels good to share.
And the connection that follows?
Well, that releases the neuropeptide oxytocin. And what does oxytocin do? It acts as a safety signal. It potently reduces activation of the amygdala, the brain's fear center. It buffers the HPA and it shifts the autonomic nervous system from fight or flight to rest and digest. And here is a cool fact. And that's why many companies struggle to be creative and they repeat their own mistakes over and over. Because once you are in these environments where you feel unsafe, when you feel judged, when you feel that you are just repressed, your creativity goes down and your stress goes up.
Yeah, that's totally true. It's probably why I don't like to work in a workplace anymore. It's also hard to be your authentic self because you do have to put on that professional mask at times. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's been a lovely episode, David. Our entire story has come full circle. By avoiding vulnerability and wearing our armor, it locks us into this chronic inflammatory high alert threat state. And practicing vulnerability skillfully with boundaries is behaviorally rewarding and helps to dampen fear on the brain and biologically buffers then our body's stress response. It is the behavioral key that unlocks our own innate anti-stress and pro-social neurobiology. So for me, this episode has been a complete paradigm shift. Vulnerability isn't the wound or the weakness. It's in fact courageous, necessary, and the biological path to healing and connection.
Yes, it's a measure of our courage. And also, Amy, I think that we are going to share now our holistic tips for our listeners today.
Yes, absolutely. So here's 5 holistic tips that you can integrate into your life daily. The first one being embrace your discomfort and find your courage. As Maslow pointed out, avoiding discomfort doesn't make you stronger. It actually makes you more fragile when life inevitably throws curveballs. So see if you could lean into small daily challenges and uncomfortable feelings. And each time you face that discomfort, you'll start to expand your emotional resilience. Number 2 is practicing micro honesty. So start small. Admit when you don't know something or when you made a mistake. Maybe share a small little minor truths with someone you trust. These little acts train you to tolerate emotional exposure and build confidence in showing up as your true, authentic, real self. And potentially one day, after planting these seeds, if these people are still trusting, then you can, in fact, share deeper parts of yourself.
Mhm.
So, number 3, importantly, is share with discernment. Brené Brown reminds us, as she said, vulnerability isn't free for all. You have to earn the right to be vulnerable with someone. Share intimate thoughts only with the people you trust and honour your boundaries, as vulnerability and discernment go hand in hand. Number 4 is to reframe our rigid thoughts. Notice self-protective thoughts like, I can't show weakness, I have to be perfect. Pause and reframe them with compassion. It's okay to ask for help and still be strong. This helps to train your mind to embrace growth over protective armor. And number 5 for today is to practice self-compassion. When you stumble, resist the urge to armor up and tell yourself, I'm human and it's okay to make mistakes or it's okay to struggle. Self compassion dissolves our shame and builds the soil where courage and vulnerability can grow. So, thank you, everyone. That's a wrap on today's dive into vulnerability, how leaning into discomfort, honesty, and boundaries can reshape how we show up. So, what's up next time?
Well, as usual, the next time we are tackling now fear factor, how our brain hijacks our decision. And we are going to go deep into how fear isn't just an emotion, it's a lens that can freeze us, that can push us to play it safe or make choices we don't even realize we are making. And it links perfectly with today's episode of vulnerability because many times we are not vulnerable because we are fearful, but it can also protect and guide us. So if we know when we to step in, we are clever. We'll explore why fear takes control and how it can shape your life and how to move through it instead of being trapped by it. So remember that if you like this episode, subscribe to our channel, to any of our platforms, wherever you like to watch or listen, and don't miss any of these episodes because understanding fear is the first step to taking back your choices. Share.
Absolutely. I'm excited for that next week episode on fear. So,
Yeah.
yeah, if you have any comments about today's episode or even about next week's, please post them. We'd love to read them and reply. Search the Holistic Academy if you can on Facebook, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Subscribe to us on Substack if you're over there. We're also on YouTube, so we look forward to seeing some of you, hearing from of you. Subscribe to us if you like it, and definitely share it with a friend if this knowledge helped you and if you think someone else could benefit from it too. Well, then, see you next week, and until then, take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone. See you next time.